Somewhere in Queens, in the days following December 18th, 1978, a telephone rings in the home of Parnell Edwards' mother. She picks it up. On the other end is a voice she recognizes, a young man who has been in and out of her son's life for years, someone her son trusted completely, someone who had spent enough time around her own family over the years that the relationship was never purely a criminal association. He is calling, according to the account that has circulated in the decades since, to offer his condolences. Her son is gone. He is sorry. He wanted her to know. The man making that call is the same man who, days earlier, had shot her son 6 times. Goodfellas gives the audience stacks Edwards' death in roughly 90 seconds of total screen time. It does not give you the part where the man who killed him picked up a phone afterward and called his mother. It does not give you the friendship that made Tommy DeSimone the person Jimmy Burke trusted to get close enough to do it. And it does not give you the specific mechanism of betrayal that made the killing possible in the first place. That Stacks Edwards opened his own door to the man who was about to end his life, because the man on the other side of that door was someone he had known since before either of them had any idea what their lives were going to become. This is the story Goodfellas skipped over entirely. The friendship, the van, the 6 gunshots, and the phone call that supposedly came afterward. How Stacks and Tommy knew each other. Parnell Stacks, Edwards, and Thomas DeSimone did not meet through the Lufthansa heist, and they did not meet through Jimmy Burke. By the time Burke's crew was assembling the people it needed for the December 1978 operation, Edwards and DeSimone already had a relationship that stretched back years into the social world of Queens that had produced both of them. The specific neighborhoods that fed Burke's crew, South Ozone Park, the streets around JFK Airport, were not large. The social world that organized crime created in that geography was dense and overlapping, and the young men who grew up in it crossed paths constantly. In the same bars, the same pool rooms, the same informal gathering spots where the older men in the life held court and the younger men watched and learned and waited for their own opportunities to be useful. Edwards and DeSimone came up together in this environment. The specific nature of their early relationship, whether it began through shared criminal activity, through neighborhood proximity, through mutual acquaintances who connected them, is not documented with the precision that would let anyone reconstruct a timeline. What is consistent across the accounts that have entered the public record, primarily through Henry Hill's testimony and the oral history that has circulated among people who were adjacent to Burke's world, is that the 2 men had a relationship that predated their formal involvement in Burke's operations, and that the relationship had the specific quality of genuine friendship rather than purely transactional association. This distinction mattered enormously for how the rest of this story unfolded. Consider what it meant to be young and ambitious in that specific corner of Queens in the mid-1960s. The pathways into adulthood were limited, and the criminal economy that surrounded JFK Airport offered something that legitimate employment in that era and that neighborhood often could not. Real money, real status, real movement up a hierarchy that rewarded specific demonstrated qualities rather than credentials or connections that working-class families in that part of the city rarely possessed. Young men found each other in that environment, because the environment was the thing that gave their ambitions somewhere to go. Edwards was black in a criminal world that was, in its formal structure, almost entirely Italian and increasingly populated by Irish associates like Burke himself. This mattered for how Edwards had to navigate his position, and it likely mattered for the specific value he placed on the relationships he did manage to build inside that world. A friendship with someone like DeSimone, someone whose family name carried weight, whose reputation was already considerable even as a young man, was not something Edwards would have treated casually. It was a relationship that had real value to his own standing and his own access to the opportunities that the criminal economy around the airport made available. DeSimone, for his part, appears to have valued the friendship on its own terms rather than purely as a calculation about what Edwards could offer him. The accounts that describe their relationship consistently use language that suggests genuine warmth rather than mere professional courtesy. The kind of friendship that survives years of separate operational assignments and different specializations, because the underlying connection between the 2 men was never primarily about what they could do for each other, in the criminal economy. Stacks vouching for Tommy. In the specific social architecture of organized crime in 1960s and 1970s New York, vouching was not a casual courtesy. When one person vouched for another, when they put their own reputation behind a newcomer's reliability and character, they were making a statement with real consequences attached. If the person vouched for turned out to be unreliable, dangerous to the crew in unmanageable ways, or a security risk of any kind, the consequences fell partly on the person who had vouched for them. Edwards vouched for DeSimone inside the Lucchese-connected world that Burke's crew operated within. This means Edwards was, at some point before DeSimone had fully established himself in Burke's operation, willing to stake his own standing on DeSimone's reliability. He was telling the people who mattered most in that world, I know this man personally. I trust this man. You could trust him too, on my word alone. This was, by any reasonable measure, not a small thing for Edwards to offer, particularly given what was already known and discussed openly about DeSimone's temperament. DeSimone was, even in his younger years, a person whose relationship to violence had no obvious ceiling, someone whose willingness to use extreme force exceeded what most people in that world considered prudent or controlled. Vouching for someone with that reputation required either a genuine confidence in DeSimone's specific loyalty and reliability, or a closeness that made Edwards willing to take the risk regardless of what the broader reputation suggested. The fact that Edwards was willing to do this tells you something about the depth of what they had. This was not two acquaintances who happened to be useful to each other. This was someone who believed, enough to put his own name behind it, that Tommy DeSimone was someone worth trusting. The mechanics of vouching in that world worked through layers of personal accountability that don't have an exact equivalent in legitimate professional life. When Edwards told the people who mattered that DeSimone could be trusted, he was not simply offering a character reference in the way someone might write a letter of recommendation for a job application. He was creating a direct line of personal accountability between his own reputation and DeSimone's future conduct. If DeSimone ever did something that damaged the crew, betrayed a confidence, or proved unreliable in a moment that mattered, the question of who had vouched for him would not be forgotten. Edwards understood this when he did it. This is part of what makes the eventual outcome so specifically brutal. Edwards extended a form of personal risk on DeSimone's behalf, early in their association, that required real trust and real confidence in who DeSimone actually was beneath the reputation for violence that preceded him. He was not wrong about DeSimone's reliability in the sense the vouching was meant to protect against. DeSimone never embarrassed Edwards by failing some operational test of trustworthiness within the crew. But the specific kind of trust that vouching represented, the kind that assumes the relationship itself creates some baseline of protection between the two people involved, turned out to mean nothing at all when Burke needed it to mean nothing. What each of them brought to Burke's world. By the time the Lufthansa planning was underway in 1978, both men occupied specific and different positions within Burke's operation, positions that reflected their individual capabilities and the specific roles that the crew's structure required. DeSimone was the enforcer, the man Burke deployed when situations required the credible threat or actual application of extreme violence. His physical presence, his demonstrated willingness, and his reputation made him valuable for exactly the kind of work that required someone capable of resolving disputes through force without hesitation. Edwards occupied a different, and in some ways, more specialized role. He had developed, over years of working at and around JFK Airport, a familiarity with the physical and logistical geography of the cargo facilities that Burke's operations depended on, which access points were monitored, which were not, how the flow of goods and vehicles moved through the facility at different times. This made him valuable for the kind of operations that required logistical execution rather than violence. Moving vehicles, managing physical assets, performing the unglamorous support work that large-scale theft operations actually depend on far more than the dramatic moments that movies tend to dramatize. Their respective roles were complementary in the operational structure of Burke's crew, and their personal friendship existed alongside this functional relationship without being defined entirely by it. They worked together. They also, by the accounts that have entered the historical record, simply spent time together in the social spaces that constituted the daily life of Burke's world, in the ordinary friendship-maintaining activities that exist in any group of young men who have known each other for years. December 11th, 1978, the van. On the night of the Lufthansa heist, Edwards was assigned a specific and unglamorous responsibility: move a vehicle that had been used in connection with the operation to a location where it would not be immediately associated with the robbery. This assignment did not require him to be present for the robbery itself. He was not among the armed men who controlled the cargo floor for the 64 minutes that the operation took. His job was logistics, the kind of work that, when done correctly, leaves no trace and draws no attention, and that, when done incorrectly, becomes the single most dangerous piece of evidence connecting an operation to the people who planned it. He did not move the van. The specific reasons why have never been established with full certainty in the public record. Accounts vary on whether the immediate cause was drugs, alcohol, exhaustion from the adrenaline of the preceding hours, or some combination, and the investigative record does not resolve this question with precision. What is established is the consequence. The van sat, visible and unexplained, near the airport overnight, and law enforcement found it the following morning. The van became, almost immediately, the most significant piece of physical evidence in what was becoming the largest cash robbery investigation in American history. Fingerprints were lifted. The vehicle was processed for trace evidence. Its presence and condition helped investigators begin reconstructing the operational architecture of the heist, confirming that they were dealing with a sophisticated, multi-person operation rather than an isolated theft. For Burke, watching the federal response develop in the days immediately following the robbery, the van represented exactly the kind of exposure his entire post-heist strategy was designed to prevent. And the man responsible for that exposure was someone Burke now had to evaluate through the same cold calculus he was applying to everyone else connected to the operation. Why Burke decided Edwards had to go. Burke's assessment of Edwards in the days following the heist combined several factors that, together, produced a conclusion Burke reached with the same speed and lack of sentimentality that characterizes other post-Lufthansa decisions. Edwards was directly connected to the single most significant piece of physical evidence the federal investigation now possessed. His failure had created a forensic trail that investigators were actively working to follow, and his position within the broader social architecture of Burke's world. Valuable, but without the deep institutional and ethnic ties that bound more centrally connected associates to the organization's structure of mutual obligation, meant that Burke's calculation about his reliability under pressure ran in a specific and unfavorable direction. This is the dimension of the story that the standard account, and the film's brief treatment of it, tends to flatten. Edwards' position in the crew, while genuine and valuable, did not carry the same weight of institutional protection that a more deeply embedded associate would have possessed. When Burke ran his risk assessment, weighing the likelihood that each person connected to the operation would maintain silence under the pressure of a major federal investigation, Edwards' specific circumstances put him near the top of the list of people Burke determined could not be reliably managed by any means other than permanent removal. The decision, once Burke arrived at it, was made within a matter of days. Burke was not a man who allowed sentiment to slow down a security calculation, even when the person being calculated about was someone he had known and worked with for years. Why Tommy was the only option. When Burke decided that Edwards needed to be removed, the question of who would carry out that removal had a narrower set of viable answers than it might initially appear. The specific operational challenge that needed solving was access. Edwards, in the days following the van's discovery, was a man who understood, at some level, that the operation he had been part of was generating serious heat, and a man with that understanding does not typically open his door without thought to just anyone. Federal investigators were active. Tension within the crew was elevated. Edwards had reasons, if he was thinking clearly about his own situation, to be cautious about who he let into his space. Tommy DeSimone was not just anyone. He was someone Edwards had known for years. He was someone Edwards had personally vouched for inside the organization. He was by every social signal that mattered in the specific relationship the two men shared, someone Edwards trusted enough not to be on guard around. This is the precise mechanism of betrayal that made the killing operationally simple in a way that any stranger's approach never could have been. Burke, unlike the men who would eventually come for DeSimone himself, did not need to construct an elaborate ruse, the way the Gambino family would later need to construct one to get close enough to kill DeSimone himself. He simply needed to send the one person Edwards already trusted completely, and the door would open without hesitation, because that is precisely what happens when the person knocking on the other side is supposed to be your friend. Whether DeSimone hesitated, whether the assignment troubled him in any way that registered with the people around him, is not something the historical record documents with any specificity. What the record establishes is the outcome. DeSimone went to Edwards. Edwards let him in. And within the close confines of wherever that meeting took place, DeSimone shot Edwards multiple times. Accounts converge on 6 shots, ending the life of a man who had spent years as his friend and who had put his own name behind DeSimone's reliability inside their shared criminal world. There's a specific detail worth dwelling on here, even though the public record cannot confirm the exact texture of the encounter. A killing that requires 6 shots in close quarters between 2 people who know each other is not the same physical event as a killing that requires 1 or 2. 6 shots suggests either a specific intent to be absolutely certain or a struggle, or both. It suggests something other than the clean, single-motion efficiency that characterized some of Burke's other cleanup operations. Whatever happened in that room took more than an instant. DeSimone had killed people before. He understood, by every account of his criminal history, exactly how to end a confrontation quickly and efficiently when the situation called for it. The fact that Edwards' killing apparently required this many rounds is itself a piece of evidence about what that specific encounter may have actually been like. Not necessarily a clean execution accepted passively by someone who never saw it coming, but possibly something that involved Edwards' understanding, in the final moments, exactly what was happening to him and from whom. What it meant to be the one who could get close. There is a specific and uncomfortable logic embedded in Burke's choice of DeSimone for this assignment that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the part of the story that gives this entire episode its particular weight. Burke was not simply selecting his most capable enforcer for a difficult task. He was specifically exploiting the existence of a genuine friendship as the operational mechanism that made the task possible. The closeness between DeSimone and Edwards, the years of history, the vouching, the trust that had been built through genuine relationship rather than mere criminal association, was not incidental to the assignment. It was the entire reason the assignment could be completed cleanly. This reflects something essential about how Burke operated and about the specific moral architecture of the world his crew inhabited. Relationships were real. People genuinely cared about each other, formed real bonds, built real trust over years of shared experience. And those same relationships were, simultaneously, operational assets that could be deployed when the organization's survival required it. The two things were not in tension within the logic of that world. They coexisted, and the coexistence is what made an assignment like this one possible in the first place. DeSimone accepting and carrying out the assignment is not, within the framework of that world, evidence that the friendship had been false. It is evidence of something more specific and more disturbing. That within Burke's crew, loyalty to the organization and its survival took precedence over personal relationships in a way that everyone involved understood, and to whatever degree they were capable of it, had already accepted as the price of operating in that world. The phone call. The detail that has circulated in accounts of this story, and that the film does not include, is that sometime after Edwards' death, Tommy DeSimone telephoned Edwards' mother to offer his condolences. This detail sits at the edge of what can be fully verified through the kind of documented, prosecutable record that underlies most of what is known about the Lufthansa aftermath. It has entered the oral history surrounding this period, passed through the accounts of people who were adjacent to Burke's world, and through the retrospective tellings that have accumulated in the decades since. Without the same evidentiary foundation that supports the more thoroughly documented elements of this story, such as the timeline of the van's discovery or the basic facts of Edward's death. What can be said is that the detail is entirely consistent with everything else known about how this world operated and about DeSimone's specific psychological architecture. He was, by every account, a man capable of extreme compartmentalization, someone who could perform an execution and then, within days, resume ordinary social relationships and ordinary social performances as though the two things existed in entirely separate registers of experience. The capacity to kill a friend and then call that friend's mother to express grief is not a contradiction within DeSimone's documented psychology. It is, if anything, a logical extension of the specific quality that made him so effective and so frightening within Burke's operation, an almost total absence of the kind of integrated emotional processing that would make such a sequence of actions feel, to most people, psychologically impossible. If the call happened as described, it represents something close to the purest expression of what this entire episode was about. A world in which genuine affection and lethal betrayal were not opposing forces, but simultaneous and coexisting realities, expressed by the same person toward the same family within the same week. There is also a reading of this detail that emphasizes something more calculating than pure psychological compartmentalization. A man who calls the mother of someone he has killed, in the same neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and where suspicion traveled fast, may have been managing appearances as much as expressing genuine grief. Showing up, or calling, as a friend who was shocked and saddened by the loss was, in a specific social ecosystem of that world, a way of deflecting the kind of suspicion that an absence or a visible lack of reaction might have generated. If Edward's mother, or anyone in her orbit, ever wondered who might have wanted her son dead, the last person she would suspect would be the young man who called to offer his condolences. Whether the call reflected genuine feeling, calculated self-protection, or some combination that DeSimone himself might not have been able to fully separate, is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty. What can be said is that the detail, whether it happened exactly as described or has been shaped somewhat by the retelling that oral history always applies to stories like this one, captures something true about the specific moral texture of the world these men inhabited, a world where the line between sincere human connection and strategic self-preservation was not always a line the people living inside it could see clearly themselves. What the movie gave you and what it didn't. Goodfellas depicts stacks Edward's death with the economy that characterizes the film's treatment of most of the post-Lufthansa cleanup killings. Brief, sudden, delivered without extended buildup, communicating the casual brutality of how Burke's crew managed the people who had become liabilities. What the film does not develop, because its narrative structure does not allow for it, is the specific friendship between the two men involved, the years of history, the vouching, the trust that made the killing mechanically simple precisely because it was emotionally devastating. The film gives you the fact of the killing. It does not give you why Tommy specifically was the one who could walk through that door without resistance. This omission is not a failure of the film so much as a structural limitation. Goodfellas is constructed around Henry Hill's perspective and the specific texture of the Edwards DeSimone friendship. Its origins, its depth, the particular quality of betrayal involved and how it ended, was not central to Hill's own experience of these events in the way it was central to the two men actually involved. Hill knew that Edwards had been killed. He knew, by his own account, that DeSimone had been the one to do it. The specific relationship history between them, while presumably understood within the crew's social world, was not the story the film needed to tell to communicate what it was trying to communicate about Burke's post-heist calculus. What gets lost in that compression is the specific moral weight of using a friendship as a murder weapon, deploying genuine trust as a tool for getting close enough to kill someone who would have been suspicious of almost anyone else. This pattern, using existing relationships as the mechanism of access for violence, recurs throughout the broader Lufthansa aftermath in ways that the film, focused on Hill's specific perspective, does not have the space to connect into a unified picture. The same logic that put DeSimone at Edward's door would, weeks later, put Gambino soldiers in a room where DeSimone believed he was about to be inducted into their family. The same logic that made trust an exploitable resource within Burke's crew was, in a different configuration, exactly what destroyed DeSimone himself. Understanding this pattern changes how you read the entire post-Lufthansa period. It was not simply a series of isolated killings carried out by whoever happened to be available and capable. Each killing in this sequence depended on a specific relationship of trust between the killer and the victim, deployed deliberately because that trust was the thing that made the killing possible without complication. The cleanup operation that followed Lufthansa was, in this sense, not just a series of murders. It was a systematic exploitation of every meaningful relationship inside Burke's world, each one used exactly once, for exactly the purpose that made it valuable in the first place. What happened to Tommy afterward? Thomas DeSimone did not have long to live with whatever he carried from the Edwards killing. Approximately 1 month later, in January 1979, DeSimone himself was killed by Gambino family soldiers in retaliation for his 1970 murder of Billy Batts. Lured to what he believed was his own induction ceremony into the Gambino family, killed by men who understood, as Burke had understood with Edwards, that the most effective way to get close to someone is to offer them something they want from someone they trust. There is a specific symmetry in this sequence that the historical record preserves without commentary. DeSimone killed Edwards by exploiting Edwards' trust in him. DeSimone was killed, weeks later, by people who exploited his own desire for advancement and his trust in the process that was supposedly delivering it. The mechanism of betrayal that he had used against his friend was, within a month, used against him. Jimmy Burke survived this entire violent period without consequence. He was not killed by the Gambino family, was not charged with either the Edwards or the Batts killings, and continued operating for years before federal investigators, working primarily from Henry Hill's eventual cooperation, assembled a case that sent him to Greenhaven Correctional Facility for the rest of his life on charges unrelated to either of these specific deaths. It is worth noting how completely Burke escaped accountability for both men's death despite having directly ordered one and indirectly set the conditions that produced the other. He never faced a jury for what happened to Edwards. He outlived DeSimone by 17 years, dying of cancer in a Buffalo hospital in 1996, while the men he had used and discarded in the winter of 1978 and 1979 were long since gone. One of them in an unmarked grave that has never been located by anyone, the other disposed of so thoroughly by the Gambino family that no remains have ever been recovered by investigators despite decades of searching. Resolution: Parnell Edwards and Thomas DeSimone grew up together in the same world, on the same streets, inside the same overlapping social geography that eventually produced Burke's crew and the operation that became the largest cash robbery in American history at the time it happened. Parnell Edwards vouched personally for DeSimone. DeSimone, when Burke determined that Edwards' failure with the van had made him too dangerous to keep alive, was the person sent to kill him. Not despite the friendship, but specifically because of it. The friendship was the access. The trust was the weapon. Edwards was shot multiple times by a man he had known for years, in a setting he had let that man into because he had no reason to believe the man posed any danger to him. He was approximately 30 years old, with a mother who outlived him and who, if the accounts are accurate, received a phone call from her son's killer within days of burying whatever grief she was processing. His failure to move a van had been the immediate trigger, but the underlying calculation that determined his death, the assessment that his ties to Burke's organization were not deep enough to guarantee his silence under federal pressure, had been running before the van was ever found. If the phone call to his mother happened the way it has been described in the accounts that have circulated since, it stands as one of the most unsettling single details in the entire history of Burke's crew. A young man capable of genuine grief, genuine social performance, genuine human connection, calling the mother of someone he had killed days earlier to tell her he was sorry for her loss. Tommy DeSimone died within weeks of his own act, killed through the same mechanism he had used. Trust exploited by someone with every reason to maintain it and every willingness to betray it when the organization required. Goodfellas gave you the deaths. It did not give you the friendship that made one of them possible or the specific human strangeness of what happened in the days after. This is the part of the story the film left out. Not because it wasn't true, but because the truth of it does not fit easily into 90 seconds of screen time. What remains, decades later, is a story that resists the clean moral categories that movies tend to impose on criminal violence. There is no villain here who is purely a villain and no victim who is purely innocent. There is a friendship that was real, a betrayal that was calculated, a death that came at the hands of someone who may have genuinely grieved it, and a system that made all three of those things true at once without anyone involved finding the contradiction unbearable enough to refuse what the system asked of them.